A group of friends, 4 souls, each with their own ghosts, set out for what should have been a carefree winter getaway in the secluded mountains of Colorado. But what they would come to realize in the frigid, biting cold was that some places, no matter how beautiful, are meant to be left alone. It was a bitter Friday evening when I, Noah, and my girlfriend Mia met up with the others at the edge of the mountain road. The place was remote, far from any real signs of life. Avery, my childhood friend, and his girlfriend Grace were already there, their headlights casting long shadows on the snow-covered path. The cabin was more isolated than we'd imagined, sitting like a ghost among the towering trees. It was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find in stories about things that go bump in the night. Avery's family had owned the cabin for years, but I had never been. I had heard the rumors, though, about the strange sounds in the woods, the flickering lights when the power was off, the long winters that dragged on endlessly with strange, unexplainable occurrences. But all of that was just old talk, right? Nothing more than drunk stories told around a campfire. We didn't think much of it as we unloaded the gear, excited for the snow and the adventure ahead. We had planned to stay for the weekend. No signal, no distractions, just the cold mountain air and time together. At least that's what we hoped for. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The air was too still, too quiet. No rustling of animals, no breeze through the branches. The snow clung heavily to the trees, and there was no sign of movement except the occasional drifts caused by the wind. "Let's get inside," Avery suggested. "I'll get the fire going." The warmth of the cabin was a relief as we walked in. The old wood floors creaked beneath our boots as we kicked off the snow and hung our coats by the door. The living room smelled of pine and old leather, with a stone fireplace at the center of it all. There was a large table with chairs, an assortment of board games stacked in the corner, and a collection of books that looked well-worn, like they'd been loved for generations. "First night's a celebration," Avery said, pouring a round of whiskey for everyone. Mia and Grace settled on the couch with blankets, while Avery and I checked out the firewood and stoked the flames. The wind howled outside, its cold fingers tapping at the windows as the shadows in the corner seemed to stretch and grow. As the evening wore on, we drank, laughed, and told stories. But as the hours passed, a strange unease crept in. It wasn't just the biting cold outside. Something seemed to whisper beneath the surface. The walls groaned. The floorboards creaked in ways that felt wrong. The air grew thicker with each passing minute, as though the house itself were breathing. "It's just the wind," Avery said, noticing the look on my face. "This old place has its quirks." Mia curled closer to me, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Grace, sitting across from us, also seemed tense, but neither of us spoke of it out loud. Later, we decided to soak away the chill in the hot tub out back, snow-covered woods. The steam rose into the cold air, and for a moment, it seemed like the world outside had vanished completely. I leaned back against the tub, eyes closed, the warmth of the water contrasting against the biting cold of the air. But when I opened my eyes, it had been before. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying in a way that didn't seem natural, and the snow that had been gently falling all evening had turned into a full-blown blizzard. I tried to shake off the unease. "It's just the storm," I muttered, but the hairs on the back of my neck refused to lie flat. We decided to call it a night, and as we trudged back inside, I caught a glimpse of something, or rather someone, moving between the trees in the distance. For a split second, I thought I saw the figure of a person, but the snow was falling so heavily that it could have been a trick of the light. "You okay?" Mia asked, sensing my hesitation. "It's nothing." But the feeling didn't leave me. That night we turned in early, exhausted from the cold and the physical exertion of the day. Avery and Grace took the room at the end of the hall, and Mia and I took the one next to it. The house creaked and groaned as the wind howled outside, and sleep was slow to come. It wasn't until the dead of night, long after I had drifted off, that I awoke to the unmistakable sound of someone moving around the cabin. The floorboards in the hallway creaked. The sound was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like someone walking very carefully. But then the footsteps grew louder. They were unmistakable now, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The storm outside had grown stronger, the wind battering the house with such force, it was as if the wilderness itself were trying to break in. I glanced over at Mia, who was still fast asleep. But the footsteps, they weren't in the hallway. They were coming from the stairs leading up to the attic. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. The sound seemed to grow closer, stopping just outside the door. I wanted to call out, to tell Avery or Grace, but I couldn't bring myself to. There was a sense of overwhelming dread in the air now. Suddenly, the door handle began to turn. I barely had time to think before the door creaked open. A pale, sickly figure stepped inside. The eyes were hollow, dark, and lifeless, and the skin was stretched tight over sharp bones. But the thing, or whatever it was, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching us from the doorway. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I felt paralyzed, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The figure didn't stay long. It seemed to vanish into the shadows of the room as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but the cold chill of its presence. I lay back down, pretending to be asleep, but I knew something was horribly wrong. I wanted to wake Mia, but I couldn't bring myself to. The next morning we all met in the living room, the atmosphere tense. Avery and Grace had heard nothing, but Mia and I were different. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, something we couldn't explain, only feel. "Let's go out for a walk," I suggested, trying to shake off the lingering dread. "Clear our heads." Avery, always the adventurous one, agreed. We bundled up in warm clothes and headed out into the blizzard, the wind cutting through us like 1,000 icy knives. The woods were silent, unnaturally silent. Even the birds were absent. It wasn't long before I noticed the footprints. At first I thought they were ours, fresh impressions in the snow, but as we walked further, I realized they were leading us deeper into the forest. "I don't like this," Grace said, her voice shaking. "We need to go back." But something compelled me to keep going, and Avery agreed. The snow was falling heavier now, and the woods seemed to close in around us. The deeper we went, the more the eerie silence took hold. No animal sounds, no wind through the trees, just the crunch of our boots in the snow and the sound of our breathing. I was beginning to feel the weight of something unseen watching us, its eyes boring into the back of our necks. That's when we heard it again, the same moaning sound I had heard the night before, low, guttural, and full of sorrow. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the storm, it was something else. We turned to leave, but the moaning grew louder, more desperate. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned quickly, heart racing, but there was no one there, just the wind. But as we retraced our steps, we realized something more horrifying. There were new footprints now, more figures, moving behind us. In the distance, through the trees, I thought I saw them. Figures, their silhouettes barely visible in the thick fog. They moved quickly, as if they were hunting, following us. They were getting closer. We ran. I was 12. At that tender age where you're brave enough to start staying home alone, but still young enough to feel the weight of every creak and shadow in the house. My parents had only recently started leaving me by myself. They trusted me, and I liked the independence. On this particular night, they were out at a dinner party, and I was home, tucked away in the basement, playing video games to pass the time. The basement was ours, a shared gaming haven for me and my older sister, Ellie. My dad had insisted the video games stay down there, away from the living room. It was a spacious basement, but there was always something about it that unsettled me. Maybe it was the dim lighting, or the way the sound seemed to carry in strange, hollow echoes. As kids, Ellie and I would sprint up the stairs after turning off the lights, convinced something was chasing us. I'd like to say I'd outgrown that fear by 7th grade, but honestly, being alone down there still gave me chills. I glanced over my shoulder every so often just to reassure myself. I was lost in my game when suddenly, bang! The sound rattled the basement window behind me, and my heart leapt into my throat. I whipped around so fast I nearly knocked over my controller. The window was dark, the snow outside blanketing the ground and muffling everything in an eerie silence. At first I thought it might have been an icicle falling or a branch scraping the glass. Trying to shake it off, I turned back to my game. But then another loud bang jolted me. This time I stood up and approached the window, my heart hammering in my chest. There were small patches of snow on the glass, and it looked like someone had thrown a snowball. "Ellie?" I muttered to myself, thinking my sister had come home early to mess with me. I decided to check. Leaving the controller on the couch, I trudged upstairs, slipping on a pair of house shoes. The night air was biting cold as I stepped outside. The snow crunched loudly under my feet, and a gust of wind cut through my hoodie. The backyard was cloaked in shadows, the brick wall to the left blocking most of the view. "Ellie," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. But then I saw it. A figure crouched in the bushes near the back fence. They were motionless, their face obscured by a hood. "Ellie, cut it out," I said, though my voice faltered as doubt crept in. Something about the figure's posture wasn't right. It didn't feel like a playful sibling. It felt wrong. Fear overtook curiosity, and I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I grabbed the phone and called my mom. "Mom, is Ellie supposed to be home?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, she's at a friend's house tonight. Why? Someone's outside. They're throwing snowballs at the windows." My mom's voice turned sharp. "Lock the doors. Don't let them know you're home." "It's too late," I stammered. I already went outside. She put me on speaker so my dad could listen. They told me to go upstairs, lock myself in my room, and wait for them to get home. My mom said she'd call the police. I followed their instructions, retreating to my room and turning off the lights. I peeked through the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The figure was now pacing in the backyard, stopping occasionally to peer into the kitchen window. My stomach dropped as I realized they were trying to open it. It wasn't a kid. This person was tall, too tall to be a teenager. Their hood obscured their face, but I could tell from their movements that they were methodical, deliberate. When they turned and looked up at the second-story windows, I ducked down, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Moments later, a sharp crack rang out. My bedroom window shook violently. I froze, not daring to breathe. The snowballs had stopped, but now they were outside my room. I called my mom back, whispering into the phone, "They're at my window. The police are on their way," she assured me. "Just stay quiet." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the doorbell rang. Peering cautiously through the peephole, I saw a lone police officer, a woman in her 40s with a stern but kind expression. I let her in, and she immediately began searching the property. I watched from the safety of the house as she swept the yard with her flashlight, her boots crunching in the snow. She checked the bushes, the patio, even climbed up on the shed roof. When she came back inside, she looked concerned. "There are footprints all over the yard," she said, "but whoever it was, they're gone now." She stayed with me until my parents returned, reassuring me that it was likely just a prank or someone trying to scare me. But as much as I wanted to believe that, something about the way the figure moved, the way they targeted specific windows, didn't sit right. I never stayed home alone again after that night. I own 3 properties. 2 of them are rentals listed on Airbnb, and the third is my home in Montreal. I always thought my Wakefield rental, a quaint, secluded cabin deep in the woods, was a peaceful getaway. But after what happened that winter night, I can never think of it the same way. The Wakefield house is a small 2-bedroom cabin, perfect for couples or small groups. It's charming, isolated, and quiet, the kind of place people come to escape the world. But sometimes, when you're that far from everything, the world finds you in ways you don't expect. That weekend, I drove up to the property after hosting a group of guests who had rented the place for a few days. Groups always made me nervous. They were unpredictable, often messy, and occasionally careless. My plan was to clean up, check for damages, and spend the night before heading back to Montreal. I always text my neighbor Isaac whenever I visit. He owns the house down the hill but rarely stays there. When I mentioned my visit, he quickly replied, asking if I could check his mailbox for a letter he'd been expecting. I stopped by his place before heading to the cabin. The driveway was buried in fresh snow and everything looked normal at first, until I saw them. Footprints. They started at the edge of the woods, trailed across his yard, and led directly to the window near the side of the house. My stomach tightened as I followed them, my breath visible in the icy air. The tracks circled the house, stopped at the back door, then disappeared back into the forest. Isaac was nonchalant when I called to tell him. "As long as they didn't break in, I'm not worried," he said, but his tone had an edge to it. "The woods attract weirdos sometimes. Just keep your doors locked." I tried to brush it off as I continued to my cabin, but unease clung to me like a shadow. When I arrived, I immediately noticed more footprints. They circled the cabin, their chaotic paths weaving in and out of the trees. It had snowed the day before, which meant someone had been here recently. Very recently. I shook it off as paranoia. People wandered through the woods all the time, right? But as I stepped inside, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The cabin was a mess. The guests had left dirty dishes in the sink, beer cans scattered on the floor, and garbage overflowing in the bin. I distracted myself with cleaning, music blaring to drown out the eerie silence. But then, I heard it. A faint crunch of snow outside the window. I froze, my heart pounding. Turning off the music, I stood still, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. I locked the front door, my hands trembling. My car was parked outside. Whoever was out there knew I was here. I didn't want to confront them, but fear pushed me to look. Grabbing a flashlight, I peeked out the window. Nothing, just snow falling in the growing darkness. The rest of the evening passed in tense silence. I worked on my laptop, pretending everything was fine. But every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. By nightfall, the snowstorm had picked up again. It was peaceful at first, the soft sound of flakes against the windows. But then the footsteps returned. They were closer this time. I sat in my bedroom, the bat in my lap, staring at the door. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, deliberately, like someone was deciding their next move. Then they stopped. I held my breath, waiting for something, but the silence was worse. Summoning every ounce of courage, I threw on my coat, grabbed the bat, and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a wall, but I ignored it as I scanned the yard with my flashlight. The footprints started near the window air conditioning unit and led into the woods. But then, I noticed something else. Scratch marks on the AC unit, like someone had climbed it. I looked up. There were marks on the roof's edge. My stomach twisted as I realized they'd been on the roof, watching me. I called the police, my voice shaking as I tried to explain. When the officer arrived, he confirmed what I feared. Someone had been on the roof, likely waiting for me to leave or fall asleep. But the most chilling moment came when we checked the woods together. The tracks didn't just vanish into the forest. They led to a cluster of trees where the snow had been disturbed, trampled in frantic circles. The officer's flashlight caught something hanging from one of the branches, an old dirty scarf. It wasn't mine. Could just be a drifter, the officer said, but his voice lacked conviction. He promised to patrol the area through the night. The next morning, I left Wakefield, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me the entire time. I haven't stayed there since. Guests come and go. None of them report anything unusual. But I know better. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the footsteps circling the cabin, and every so often I wonder if they ever really left.